Hi guys, George with Troglodyne here, and now I'm going to talk about, since I just got done talking about some of the interviews that I've blown over the years, trying to get a job or get a contract or something like that. I'm going to talk about all the times that I've blown a job, period, after working in places for a number of years. Just getting yourself fired, right? So, the easiest way to get fired is the obvious ones, like not knowing what you're doing and getting let go of after your introductory period, or I don't know, dropping tables and not having backups. Those are good ways to get fired. Just screw up and you're done, right? But as a guy like me who's worked in places for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, um, that's usually not why you're going to be fired, because you kind of know what you're doing and you generally don't screw up, right? And when you do screw up, you make sure that you can recover from it. So what you're going to get fired for in those cases is always going to be a power politics kind of thing, right? So uh, the first place that I worked was Texas Instruments, and a lot of people, its abbreviation is TI, which a lot of people mean Training Institute, because most people they work there 4 years and they get the hell out. And a lot of that is because, it's like a lot of these other humongous corporations, in that if you think that they have any particular care for you as an individual employee, you got another thing coming, buddy. It's just at that scale, they can't care. And if they do, it would actually be worse. So that's sort of the first thing you have to understand, is that they're going to be doing a lot of big ham-fisted things. Like, for example, I sort of got into the company and into the job market in general after I got my mathematics degree, right during the '06, '07 into '08 crisis in the economy. And so I'd been working at TI for about a year before they essentially announced some pretty savage layoffs, because their stock was starting to tank with all the rest of the tech in the sort of cascade failure of the stock market, as all of these different co-parties and all that started to fail as a result of the mortgage lunacy in '08 and '07. And so that was my first exposure to, maybe I actually do have something, that's special here, in that I got fired and rehired in the same day. So basically, my whole team was cut, and they only decided to keep, I think, 3 people from our entire set. We were doing like some kind of, they call it insource outsource, which is basically a long way of saying we figured out a complex legal way of violating the duck rule without actually getting in trouble for it. And it was in practice the same as working as an employee, because you went to the same office as everybody else and all that stuff. And long story short, uh, basically they just renegotiated the contract with the house that was doing that, and probably paid them less per worker. And then they were like, well, we'd still like to have the contract because we like the relationship, and we foresee that past this retrenchment we'll hopefully be able to expand it, yada yada yada. It's a thing that you're going to have to do if you ever do any kind of like staffing or recruitment. You're going to have to get used to those kind of concepts. But anyways, I stuck around. A lot of that probably had to do with sort of another fundamental power thing, with regard to, if you can do things no one else can do in the department, your head's going to be on the chopping block last. That's just a reality, because it may not be that they absolutely need you, that they literally can't do without you. At a firm that size, yeah, they could do without you, no matter who you are. But it's a relative thing, right? They can definitely do without you a lot less than they can somebody who is just, cranking it out and, essentially working like an assembly line. I was doing quality assurance at the time. And if all you're doing is just following test cases, writing test cases, anybody can do that stuff. Okay. On the other hand, if it's like what I'd done there, which was I made this introspection sort of library for 4-bit microcontroller scientific calculators, that was looking at the flags and looking at the memory regions, and comprehensively keeping track every step to see if we had a flag getting stepped on, so that I could start to find memory corruption, all those sorts of really weird bugs. Nobody else was making that kind of tooling in the department that I was, because they were just not that talented in programming. In my mathematics education, I'd taken numerical analysis, which basically teaches you to program. And so, I was writing Python scripts, and I was fixing some of the Fortran scripts that they had for testing, numerical accuracy and things like that for whatever the calculator was doing that was new. All those sorts of things were stuff that I was doing all the time there. And obviously, that's going to make you a good deal more valuable than your fellow workers. And me being like dumb kid right out of college, I was doing this stuff for cheap, man, super cheap. So it was kind of a no brainer to keep me around, right? And I wish I'd known, earlier just about how valuable I was, but that's just a reality. And sometimes it's good to be underpaid, in that, again, in hard times, you're going to be the last to go because it's just one more feather in your cap, of why do you need to stick around. But that said, sticking around is not necessarily the best thing in your life. Certainly, getting fired when I've had plenty of money to deal with it, that's actually been a really good thing for me. I mean, sort of, that's where I am right now with regard to, I got fired at one place and just decided, well, I mean, look, I don't have to work for a while. I've got plenty saved up. Let's just, go ahead and build my professional reputation, build my skills, all that stuff, so that I can make way, way more if I decide to actually go and get a contract, or if I decide to get employed again, whatever it is. And so the other thing that really helped a lot with regard to dealing with all these sorts of things was, there's a concept called only appealing to self-interest, right? You can appeal to people in a lot of different ways. And I learned very early on, with regard to dealing with the management, that you can't appeal reliably to anything other than their own self-interest, right? And so I found that my job description and stuff like that was very rarely having anything really to do with actually what got you promoted, what got you more money, what kept you on at the firm, anything like that. No, it turns out that a lot of that is just appealing to the self-interest of the boss, which their interest is naturally like, we don't have risk. I'm keeping, my head count where I want it to be, and I have various like super flashy projects, or super whiz bang that I want executed on, and I am not being given the resources. So it would be a super huge scalp that I could take if I could do that. And that's sort of where I always would specialize and try to optimize for, was taking those scalps that they wanted me to take, and that would be surprising to their superiors, so that they could then get promoted, and yada, yada, yada. And, like I said, I was underpaid at the time, and, they were taking good credit for that. But, on the other hand, they also, really liked me as a result of that. And, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not worth it. But at the time, that's what I was up to. So, um, the other stuff that I was doing was, and this was sort of towards the end of my career there, was I was sort of just solving problems for random groups that nobody else could figure out. Like, they had a bunch of data that they didn't know how to deal with UTF-8, and I did at the time, so I fixed it all for them. And then another thing that they had where they totally had zero Linux expertise, and I did, so I ported the TI-84 emulator to the Linux stack, because they kind of wanted to have like a server-based calculator thing. Because if you're not familiar with the TI calculators division, essentially the whole business model is uh, artificially inflating test scores on standardized tests through use of calculators. And, it's one of those things. Yeah, a lot of people don't like the term artificially inflating it, because, I mean, let's be real. I mean, based on the methodology that's used to teach stuff nowadays, I think it's actually realistic to use a calculator. But it is literally artificial, right? This is not like pencil and paper. This is not like just coming straight out of the mind. This is, I know how to use tools to actually get the thing done, rather than I am just using raw brain power to actually solve these problems, which is the way it was before calculators. And I mean, there's something to be said for that with regard to taking that approach. But in general, when it comes to standardized testing and uh, pre-college stuff, that's just sort of what people are standardizing on now. Is Just you just need to be able to use tools. Okay, you don't need to understand the math behind it, all that kind of stuff. So, I certainly don't hate the game, and I don't even hate people who play it because it's just how it has to be. Um, you do better when you actually understand the math behind it, but again, that's just sort of relegated to college these days. Anyways, so the next thing to focus on is how did I get fired, man? So we had a couple of different projects at the time. I was working on what's called the core projects, which actually, in essence, means they're cash cows, right? Because in case any of you guys aren't familiar, you're going to have cash cows, you're going to have falling stars, rising stars, and I think there's one more category. They've sort of got like a quadrant sort of thing about what project meta category that a particular product fits into. And I was working on cash cows. I mean, these things have been out in the field for years. Like I said, they were using 4-bit microcontrollers or Z80s or something like that. That these are obviously not like high technology. This is actually a bunch of obsolete stuff, but that is good enough to solve the problem that school districts need to solve. And when I'm looking at their new product that they have, I was looking at it from that perspective. Like, I'm the core products guy. We're the cash cow guy, and their Rising Star product was this thing called the Inspire, which was essentially a CAS on a stick, right? Computer algebra system on a stick. It had precise math. It had all those sorts of neat bells and whistles that generally people don't get into that stuff in college, and that to me was the thing that I saw as sort of the fatal flaw of the business model was the target market. I didn't see college as necessarily wanting to go down that route because again they were focusing not on practical application but they were focusing on theory. And this is because I had literally just gone through a math degree in the last 4 years, and I was kind of like, so where are they doing this? This doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that probably what they were hoping was that there were some more advanced districts, like in some other countries and stuff like that, that were doing that sort of thing. But after a few years, it became reasonably clear that they just weren't getting the kind of success that they wanted based on the amount of money they were putting into it. And, at some point, I just said the obvious about that, in a very public way, and you probably shouldn't do that. It turns out that a lot of times you're going to see things like that that are obvious at a firm. And even though it's obvious to more than just you, nobody says anything about it because it's not their place to do this, right? Um, my place was to, as a QA, provide information that's actionable to stakeholders, right? And the question is, was that actionable information to stakeholders? No, I was just actually telling them something they already knew. They were just not acting on it because that was not what they were interested in doing at the time. I didn't understand that their motivations were not in line with what I thought the motivation should be for management, which, it's a public firm. You should be basically chasing the way to maximize profit so that you can get the customer, get the shareholders hooked up massively, right? I mean, that's sort of the textbook definition of the way a public firm should work. But in practice, that's not how it works. In fact, you're going to have principal agent problems everywhere. And the second you start to give people even a whiff that the reality is not the way that it ought to be, people start to get upset real fast. Okay. And so you can't really tell them those sorts of things because that's what they hire outside consultants to give them that information on. And then they never act on it. Right. So that's how it actually works. As a tester and things like that, they don't want you to test the process. They don't want you to test the assumptions. Even though, yes, again, as a QA, the earlier you catch something in the process, the better. But the fact was, at that point, they had already devoted millions and millions and millions of dollars to doing this thing. So, pointing out that the ship had a gigantic hole in it from the very beginning, that was not going to get me anywhere other than fired, and that's precisely what it got me. So, after that, I a sort of interesting thing happened. I went to work for this firm called cPanel, which some of my friends were working at, and within a couple of months of accepting the job there and starting doing it, I got a email from one of the people who I had been working with at TI, and it was one of the programmers there had been there for a long time, and he wanted to see if I would go and work on the calculators from a programming end of things, and I sort of was like, well, so what happened, and he's like, well, it kind of turns out that the person you pissed off kind of got fired for, the exact reason you were saying, because it turned out that's exactly why they needed to be fired. And nobody was just saying anything about it. And, I ended up being the excuse to get some change happening around there. And, the fact was that oxes needed to be gored. And, sometimes that actually works out. It just doesn't work out for you doing it personally because you're going to get fired. And there's no guarantee that whatever you're going to say is actually going to have positive change. I'd seen other people do exactly the same thing, gore somebody's ox, get fired, and nothing ever happened. So, I don't think it's in particular because I had anything, any particular gift at saying it. I think it was just I was in the right place at the right time for the power politics that was going on at the firm. Anyways, I'm guessing that made it to where it was not a hard no with regard to me working with him. And I'd considered it, but I ultimately passed on it because I had the suspicion, which I should have kept later in my life, that you sort of can't ever go back. That once a bridge is burned, you don't want to go and rebuild the bridge and go back over there. And it didn't seem like what they were offering was really that much better than what I was getting at cPanel at the time. So I just moved on. And so I stayed at cPanel despite a brief hiatus at my cousin's startup for a couple of years. I stayed there for almost 8 years. And, nevertheless, at the end of the day, I got fired there too, baby. Yeah. So let's talk about, before I actually, talk about sort of how I managed to stay at a firm for 8 years. Oh my God. Uh, let's talk about sort of my startup experience there. And I wouldn't say I got fired so much there as the company failed, which is even worse than getting fired. So, my cousin called me up and he was telling me that he built this thing to help what they call storm chasers, which are essentially roofers that their whole business model is waiting until hailstorms happen and then doing insurance claim roof replacements. So uh, we took the data from the WSR88D NOAA weather radar network, which you could download for free. Anybody could do this. And then rasterizing it using a toolkit that they had provided for free that we made some modifications to have some more advanced visualizations based on a few white papers and stuff like that had come out. We had our own meteorologist on staff and stuff, making sure that stuff was all more or less kosher. Uh, but the point was, we wanted to try and most accurately tell you so where was the hail falling most intensely in the storm and all that stuff, so that they could more accurately canvass neighborhoods with regard to who they're going to talk to and say, hey, did we have a storm here? Did we have a storm there? All that kind of stuff. So I ended up building a product there called OneSite, which was basically a 2-year report of all the hail that had happened at the site there, and it eventually got extended to more types of data like wind or lightning strikes, you name it. Uh, because that's pretty obvious. There's several other organizations and especially established players that had even made similar reports about like, well, what's happening in a property, and that was what we were aiming on horning in at. But the firm ultimately it failed because the founders sort of had a lack of confidence in themselves and they hired a literal con man to run the company. And so they did a funding round and it sort of just didn't the funding round worked out great, but they sort of declared victory and went on a vacation afterwards, the two founders. And when they came back, they found the place had essentially been looted by this CEO. And that was when I had to do a lot of things that I really shouldn't have done with regard to working too hard for the firm to keep it afloat. I, in that month, more or less kept the shop running. I'd done everything you need to do. I'd fielded a lot of customer requests, support requests, dealt with the sales department that was lying to customers, and a lot of other things that, really, like a lot of other people get this experience at startups. I was not being paid to do that. You know, I was not being adequately paid to wear all those hats because those were some jumbo XL 10-gallon hats there that I was stepping into. And I think I did all right. The firm actually didn't go bankrupt. It actually managed to keep its operations going, all those sorts of things. The founders eventually wrested control from it, but the fact was that had basically destroyed any momentum that the firm could have had, and they we had to essentially furlough our pay, and I wasn't getting paid, or I was getting paid minimum wage for a while, and for really working like an animal. And I just couldn't do it after about 6 months of that. I'd basically gotten tapped out, and I was like, okay, well, I got to go do something else. I'm going to go back to work for CPAL. And thankfully, they accepted me right back. And this sort of gives you a insight into sort of another power law that is nice, in that absence, a lot of times, especially if you leave on good terms, can really help you out with regard to your ability to earn and the respect people have for you at a firm and all those sorts of things. But these effects are temporary, right? They're not going to last forever. At some point, people are going to get comfortable with you. They're going to get comfortable with the boundaries you set. They're going to get comfortable with all those sorts of things. And so we eventually, okay, let me start. I was QA there again, okay? And so that was sort of my expertise. And I stuck to the formula that had worked for me at TI, which was essentially be better at doing that than anybody else at the firm. And I more or less accomplished that. I also stayed with this sort of theme of being super automator, of a guy solving these problems that are not necessarily, oh, I need to program this for the customer. It's more like, I need a program to solve this problem so I can solve the other problem for the customer. You know, productivity was sort of my bag, and solving these little problems that nobody else could solve because either the organization couldn't devote resources to it, or just nobody cared about the problem enough to actually automate it. You know, the only people who cared about it didn't have the ability to do anything about it. That's the point. And so I sort of built that indispensability again, relative again. But at some point, you know, a QA is not exactly an exalted field amongst IT, and there's a limit to your earning potential. You know, you're not making six figures in the QA field is actually very, very rare. And I was getting there. So I decided that I needed to transition to full-time development, because essentially that's what ran the firm, and that's what was being rewarded, and that's sort of where the exalted positions were. So I did that by going and getting an offer from another firm to do precisely that. And I was like, all right, look, you know, I'm going to interview with you guys to do developer. You guys accepted me as that. But I've also got this other offer here to do this some other firm, paying me a lot more than you were going to pay me to do this. So let's get me fixed up. And they agreed. They accepted the counter offer, and we moved on from there. But you know, it'd been years since I'd read those nice articles about, you know, hey, you shouldn't do this. You should just accept the other offer and move on. And so I was, again, this was like 6 years into working at the firm. And you know, when you work for a place for 6 years, you're pretty emotionally invested. And so it's easy for you to stick around because, again, you've got friends there, you've got a lot of code there, you've got a lot of reasons to stick around. But at the end of the day, that, you know, put the poison in the relationship and the resentment at the management level, that really they were looking for a reason from that point on, and they found it. You know, I should have sort of seen this coming with regard to I got relocated to a different team, I got relocated to a different manager. All those things should really pick your spidey senses up, that they're sort of trying to put you in a situation where a boundary is going to be crossed so they can, you know, let the axe fall and do as it may. So that's essentially what happened. Was I was used to being friends and discussing things like you would with friends, right? And it turns out in a new environment, they're not your friends, man. You need to be real careful what you talk about. In fact, you actually should probably just keep it super duper professional until you've built trust. But you know, some people on the team were already familiar with me, and I could talk friendly with them. And you know, that mix there is what made it dangerous to where I really shouldn't have done that, because it's like, okay, other people don't understand what I'm talking about, and that crosses their boundary. And boss was looking for a reason to get rid of me, and so he just escalated it, and that was it. I wouldn't say it's exactly bad faith, but the fact was at that point, like I said in the prior video, everybody, if they've been in a place for years, they're going to have reasons to get rid of you. They're going to have reasons, and they did. So that's all it took, was just, let's escalate it and get them out of here. So could I have handled the situation a bit different? Even with the crossing the boundary? Oh yeah, yeah. When you do that, you have to understand, what are they going to see as congruent with your behavior thus far? What are they going to see as de-escalating the situation versus escalating the situation? And what is it your manager is looking for right there? And so in retrospect, I understand what he was looking for. I mean, the guy, he made the classic mistake of demanding an apology. And, anybody who is actually on a logical and rational and like super skilled at management level of thinking, they would never ever do that, because they know all that does ever is backfire, right? It is never seen as anything other than insincere. And so what he would have done if he had actually wanted to de-escalate the situation is usually just, it's time for a transfer, whatever. But the fact was, if he had done that, if he had done a transfer or something like that, that would have essentially been an admission of mistake on his part, that he shouldn't have moved me from where I was. And so that's why it sort of became a point of, no, this has to work, this has to be right. And so that's where you have to make a big point of making sure that it looks like to him the problem is going to be resolved. The problem is going to work out the way they want to, right? That it's going to make it look like they made the right decision to move you here. And so, you know, that's not what I was focused on. I was more focused on, look, man, I'm. Why are you guys acting in this way that is so inconsistent with your prior behavior towards me? You know, and so I could have avoided it, yeah, but that's not going to happen when you're really comfortable with a situation. You're going to make these mistakes. And so, whatever, chips fell. Like I said in the last video, at some point you start to realize, okay, the jig is up, and I'm just going to shut up and let it happen. And so that's how that worked. And the best story that I've read ever since that sort of made me understand what was going on here was the story of the Count of Carmaniola. And he was a mercenary during the days of the Condottieri Wars in Italy. And he had been one of the greatest ever, right? So he'd won a lot of battles for the, I believe, the Milanese and also the Venetians. But he made a mistake when he dealt with the Venetians, in that he was doing the usual sort of mercenary thing of playing sides against each other. And the Venetians were not, bankrupt losers like the most of the little petty kingdoms there in Italy. No, they were very unappreciative of this behavior, and they eventually called him back to the palace there. And instead of leading him to be congratulated by the Doge for his great victory, they led him across the Bridge of Sighs to a place, which was the dungeon. So uh, that's sort of the thing you have to understand, is that you can be as skilled as you want. You can be as indispensable, you think relatively to the firm, as you want. You can be a key man even, but it won't matter if they don't see you as loyal and acting in the way that is consistent with what they want the firm to be, okay, and what they want their workers to be with regard to any individual manager. And so you could be the best, and from a rational point of view, it doesn't make any sense for them to fire you, but they'll still do it because uh, brooking any kind of challenge to their authority like that, they view as more dangerous in the long term to the survival of their firm than like actually doing the things that make their firm survive. So that's the thing you have to be aware of, and now I'm aware of it, right? I'm going to make new mistakes now, not that one anymore. So what I said in the last video sort of is the best capper to this, in that you have to know your role. You have to know, what is it people want from you here? What is it that people are hiring you for. And again, this is not what is in your job description. You have to understand that in a lot of cases, especially in corporate, they want a star, but they don't actually need a star. What they need is a cog, and when it comes down to whether you stick around or not, it's a question of need, not a question of want, right? So if you don't look like that cog, even though you're a star in reality and should have more latitude than a cog in a machine, they're going to act like you need to be a cog in a machine because that is the emotional investment of their relationship towards you in the firm. So don't ever get it twisted. And whenever it looks like these sorts of things are starting to happen, if you want to stick around, then you have to start exhibiting those behaviors that make them think of you in that regard rather than in the I'm a prima donna star right here that thinks he can, expect special treatment, even though if you probably should. So the best advice, of course, is get out of there once that starts happening. I didn't take my own advice because at that point I sort of acquired enough capital. I was like, don't worry about it. I've sort of had enough of this firm anyways, and I want to try my hand at this whole online reputation building and building a firm and so forth. So that's sort of where I'm at. And now it's not quite a year that has gone into it. Made a little money, but I haven't made much. And that's where I've started to consider, okay, well, maybe I need to take on another contract. Maybe I need to do all that stuff rather than focusing so much up front on the aspects of making a micro independent software vendor. I mean, I'm still going to do that. I'm still working on that. But does this mean that I can also sharpen my saw by doing interviews with companies, doing all these sorts of things? Yeah. And do I think I could have a good relationship doing contracts? Yeah. Yeah. So that's sort of the motivation behind this series I've been doing right now is getting all that pulled together for you guys. And hopefully you learned something from all of my wonderful panoply of mistakes that I've made over the years. And again, some of my victories here. You don't get to stay at a firm for 8 years by not being good at your job, So if you enjoyed this kind of content, like and subscribe to the video, and I will see you later.